I'm a 36-year-old woman, and I grew up in what most people would call a comfortable middle-class family. My younger brother Ryan is 34. We didn't have a picture-perfect childhood, but we never went hungry, and our parents were always careful with money. Or so I thought, until I was old enough to notice how that money seemed to flow more in one direction. When Ryan finished high school, my parents paid for his entire college education. No loans or part-time jobs required. They covered his rent, helped with his wedding, and even handed him a generous down payment for his first house. For me, there were no such offers. I worked 2 jobs all through school, juggled classes and late-night shifts, and saved every extra dollar until I could afford my own small place. My parents congratulated me when I signed the mortgage, but it was the kind of applause people give when they've been watching from the sidelines. I never said anything. Not when Ryan's degree was paid off while I was still sending in checks to my student loan company. Not when they bought him a new car after his old one broke down. Not when I was patching up my own secondhand car with duct tape on the bumper. I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss over. Their money, their choice. Things didn't change when we became parents ourselves. Ryan and his wife had 2 boys, now 8 and 10, and my daughter Sophie came along a year after the youngest. Sophie's dad, my husband, passed away when she was still little, and she's grown up close to his side of the family. She's a quiet, artistic kid, happiest with a sketchbook in her lap. From the start, it was obvious my parents were all in on being grandparents, just not equally. Ryan's boys got elaborate birthday parties with rented bounce houses, balloon arches, and full dessert tables, private school tuition, sports team fees, high-end sneakers, gaming consoles. My parents were right there to cover it all. For Sophie, there'd be a modest gift on her birthday, maybe a sweater or a set of pencils. She always smiled and said thank you, but I noticed the way she'd glance at the mountain of presents her cousins were unwrapping every Christmas. The travel thing was the hardest to ignore. My parents took Ryan's family to Hawaii, to Europe, to Disney more than once. They'd come back with photos of castles and beaches, smiling with Mickey Mouse. Sophie and I would get a fridge magnet from the trip. Whenever I asked why we weren't invited, the answer was always some variation of, "Oh, Sophie probably wouldn't enjoy that," or "She's too shy for big group trips." It kept going like this for years. I kept my head down, tried to focus on raising Sophie the best I could. I didn't want to turn her into someone who expected things to be handed to her, but I also couldn't ignore the growing gap between how my parents treated her and her cousins. The breaking point came at a family dinner one evening. We were sitting at the table, me, Sophie, my parents, Ryan, and his family, when my dad casually announced that they'd set up college funds for both of Ryan's boys. "We wanted to make sure they're taken care of for the future," he said, like it was just another piece of news. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "We didn't set one up for Sophie since Emily is financially independent." The table stayed quiet for a moment. Sophie looked down at her plate and blinked fast, like she was trying not to cry. I reached for her hand under the table. Ryan broke the silence with a grin, saying something about how I was lucky to have a stable job, and how it must be nice not to need the extra help. I didn't argue. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make the air in that room heavier than it already was. But that night, as I was driving Sophie home, I kept replaying the moment in my head. I couldn't give her what my parents had given Ryan's family in terms of money, and maybe I never would. But there had to be something I could give her that would mean just as much, if not more. I started to think about what couldn't be measured in dollar signs. Experiences, memories, things that no one could take away or overshadow. Sophie had always been drawn to art. Ever since she was little, she'd fill notebooks with drawings of anything she could see. I'd find sketches tucked into her school binders, her room, even in my work bag where she'd slip them in as surprises. Money-wise, I wasn't sitting on a fortune, but I knew if I planned carefully, I could make something big happen for her, something that would stand on its own, no matter what her grandparents did or didn't do. It wouldn't be about one-upping Ryan or proving anything to anyone. It would be about giving Sophie something to hold on to for the rest of her life. That night, when we got home, Sophie went straight to her room to read. I stayed in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, thinking about what I could do. I knew I couldn't change my parents. I couldn't control what they gave or didn't give, but I could control what I put into Sophie's life. By the time I went to bed, I'd already made up my mind. Whatever it took, I was going to give my daughter an experience that couldn't be wrapped in shiny paper, shoved into a closet, or compared to someone else's gift pile. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew this. It would be hers and hers alone, and no amount of favoritism could touch it. Once I decided what I wanted to do for Sophie, I started looking into every possible program that could match her love for art. I spent nights scrolling through websites, reading about youth workshops, art retreats and study programs in different countries. Most were too short, too expensive, or too generic. I wanted something that would actually challenge her and also give her a chance to see a part of the world she'd only ever read about. At home, I started slipping in casual questions while we were cooking dinner or driving to school. I asked her about the places she'd love to see one day, the artists she admired the most, the museums she'd want to walk through if she could. She lit up when she talked about Italy, how she'd read about the Renaissance in art class, and how the colors in Botticelli's paintings looked different from anything else she'd seen. She said Florence sounded like a city made for artists. One afternoon at work, a coworker overheard me talking about Sophie's love of art. She mentioned that her niece had done a summer youth art program in Florence the year before, and that it had been life-changing. She pulled up the website on her phone and showed me the photos. Students sketching in front of centuries-old buildings, painting in studios with huge windows, visiting famous galleries with instructors explaining the history. The more I read, the more I knew this was it. The cost made my stomach drop at first. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't impossible either. Not if I planned everything out and cut back hard for a year. I sat down with a notepad and wrote out what it would take: the tuition, flights, a small apartment for us, food, and a little cushion for emergencies. It was going to mean sacrifices, but the numbers added up if I stuck to it. When I saw that the program allowed parents to come along as chaperones, I felt like a door had opened. I wouldn't have to send Sophie alone, and I could be there to make sure she got the most out of it. That same night, I filled out the application and sent it in. A week later, I opened my email and saw the acceptance letter. She had a spot in the program. I sat there staring at the screen for a while, thinking about how much I wanted to tell her right away, but I didn't. Not yet. I wanted the reveal to be something special, something she would remember forever. The next step was getting time off work. I talked to my boss and explained that I needed 3 weeks away in the summer. It meant unpaid leave, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. Once the dates were set, I circled them in my calendar and started counting down. In the meantime, I began laying the groundwork for the surprise. I found a weekend Italian class for kids at a community center and told Sophie it would be fun to learn a new language together. She was excited, thinking it was just for fun. Every Saturday morning, we'd drive to the class and she'd practice ordering food or asking for directions. Of course, my parents caught wind of it and made their opinions known. They laughed about how impractical it was to learn Italian when no one around here spoke it. My mom suggested she should focus on useful skills instead. Ryan didn't miss his chance to throw in his own comment about how hobbies were nice, but skills that pay were better. I didn't argue. I just let them talk while Sophie kept practicing. She had no idea there was more to it. To her, the Italian lessons were just another one of my random ideas, like when we tried baking bread for a month or planted a vegetable garden. I started making changes at home to save faster. I sold a dining set that was too big for our space and replaced it with a small secondhand table. I canceled subscriptions we didn't really use. I put off replacing the washer that rattled like a freight train. On weekends, I picked up extra shifts when Sophie was at a friend's house or with her aunt. Speaking of her aunt, my late husband's sister, she became my quiet ally. When I told her about the plan, she didn't hesitate to offer help. She had travel backpacks we could borrow, a good camera we could use, and tips for packing light. Every time we met up, she'd slip me something useful: a guidebook, a phrase book, a portable charger. She never said a word about it to anyone else. By the start of spring, I realized I was ahead of schedule. I had set my goal for early summer, but by March, I had enough to cover everything. It felt strange to have the money sitting there, ready, after months of counting every penny. I didn't waste any time. I booked the flights, paid the program fees, and found a small apartment in Florence near the art school. It wasn't fancy: 2 rooms, a little balcony, and a kitchenette, but it was perfect for what we needed. I printed out the confirmation emails and tucked them into a folder I kept hidden in my desk. With everything locked in, I started thinking about how to finally tell Sophie. I wanted it to be something she'd remember just as much as the trip itself. I started collecting small things for her: an Italian flag patch, a little watercolor set, a map of Florence, things I could put together for the reveal. In the meantime, the weeks kept moving, and I had to act like nothing was different. Sophie kept going to Italian class, learning new words, and sketching in her notebooks. Ryan's family had their usual busy schedule: sports games, trips, school events, with my parents cheering from the sidelines. No one had the slightest idea what I was planning. By the time the last payment went through, the reality hit me. Everything was in place. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to let Sophie in on the secret. I imagined her reaction, but I didn't let myself dwell on it too much. I wanted the day to come without me giving anything away. I kept thinking about how in a few short months, we'd be walking down cobblestone streets, eating gelato, and standing in front of the art she'd only ever seen in books. And she had no idea it was coming. That, more than anything, kept me moving through the long work days and the endless lists of things to prepare. It was almost time. The plan was real. The countdown had started. Sophie's birthday fell on a Saturday that year, and I had been planning the reveal for weeks. I woke up early, set the table with her favorite breakfast: pancakes shaped like animals, strawberries, and a small stack of wrapped gifts. The main present wasn't wrapped at all, though. I had made a scrapbook filled with photos, postcards, and little clues about the trip. The first page had a photo of an artist's palette, the second a picture of a cobblestone street, then a page with an Italian flag. Each page after that gave her a little more of the puzzle, until the last one held the printed confirmation letter from the Florence art program. She flipped through slowly, reading every word. When she got to the last page, she froze. Then her eyes widened and her hands covered her mouth. Her voice caught as she asked if this meant we were going to Italy. I nodded. She burst into tears, happy ones, and hugged me so tight I almost couldn't breathe. That afternoon, we had a small family get-together at my parents' house. Sophie was still glowing, telling me in the car all the things she wanted to do and see. The moment we walked in, she couldn't hold it in and shared the news with her grandparents. They smiled politely, said it sounded nice, then immediately turned the conversation toward Ryan's boys and their upcoming soccer tournament. Ryan grinned in that way that wasn't really friendly and made a comment about me trying to make Sophie cultured. He said it like it was a joke, but the tone told a different story. Sophie didn't seem to notice. She was too busy pulling out the scrapbook to show her cousins, who glanced at it for about 5 seconds before running off to play video games. By the next day, she had already started making lists of art museums she wanted to visit. She spent hours on the computer looking at the Uffizi Gallery, sketching the facade of the Duomo from photos, and reading about famous painters. Every morning before school, she added something new to her list: places, foods, or even streets she thought would be fun to see. Her sketchbook started filling faster than I'd ever seen. She drew every day, sometimes in pencil, sometimes in watercolor. There were drawings of our cat, the view from her bedroom window, and even an attempt at copying a famous painting she'd found online. A week later, my parents called with a suggestion. They thought maybe they should come along on the trip. They said it would be fun for everyone and that they could help out. I told them no, that this trip was something I wanted to do with Sophie alone. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know about how that was received. It didn't take long for the comments to start coming in from other family members. Ryan's wife mentioned offhand that my parents thought I was showing off with this trip. I told her plainly it wasn't about showing off, it was about giving Sophie something for her own growth. She just shrugged and changed the subject. While that noise swirled in the background, I got down to the details. I booked guided tours that included sketching time, mapped out walking routes that passed the most beautiful parts of the city, and reserved spots in a couple of local workshops. I wanted Sophie to experience the art, but also the everyday life of Florence: markets, side streets, hidden courtyards. A few weeks later, we were at another family dinner when my parents brought up the trip again. This time, they asked if I thought Sophie might get homesick being so far away for so long. Sophie didn't even pause before answering that even if she did, it would be worth it. The conversation ended right there. With the departure date getting closer, we started shopping for what we'd need. We went to an art supply store where Sophie picked out travel-sized watercolor sets, extra sketchbooks, and good pencils. At a clothing store, we found comfortable walking shoes, light jackets, and a couple of dresses for special outings. She loved every minute of it, checking each item off our packing list as we went. A few days before we were set to leave, Ryan decided to weigh in again. He said I should have used the money for something more practical for Sophie's future, maybe for her college or for a car when she was older. I didn't answer him. I just let him talk while I finished loading groceries into my car. The night before our flight, Sophie and I stayed up late in the living room with the suitcases open beside us. We put together a playlist for the trip: Italian songs, music from movies set in Europe, and some of her favorite upbeat tracks. She kept dancing around the room, tossing clothes into her suitcase, making sure she had her sketchbooks and pencils packed first. When everything was ready, we set the alarm for the early morning. Sophie double-checked her backpack for her passport and a small stuffed animal she always traveled with. She slid the scrapbook I'd made her into the front pocket so she could look at it on the plane. We went to bed buzzing with excitement, knowing the next time we woke up, we'd be starting the biggest adventure we'd ever taken together. The flight to Florence felt endless, but when the plane finally dipped below the clouds and the Tuscan landscape came into view, Sophie pressed her face to the window and didn't move. Rolling green hills, terracotta rooftops, and the glitter of the Arno River snaking through the city. It was like watching a painting come to life. When the plane touched down, she gripped my arm, still staring out at the view. Getting through the airport was a blur of customs lines and luggage carousels, but the moment we stepped outside, the air was different. Warmer, softer, and filled with a mix of coffee, fresh bread, and something floral I couldn't quite name. The taxi ride into the city was quiet, except for the sound of Sophie's camera clicking every few seconds as she tried to capture the narrow streets and the buildings with their peeling paint and overflowing flower boxes. Our apartment was a modest, two-room space with creaky wooden floors and tall windows that opened out to a small balcony. From there, you could see straight into the piazza below, where people sat at cafe tables, sipping espresso and chatting in rapid Italian. The kitchen was small but cozy, with a gas stove and mismatched plates in the cupboard. Sophie immediately went out to the balcony, leaning over the railing to watch a street artist painting a couple on the corner. That first evening, there was a knock on our door. An elderly woman stood there holding a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth. She lived in the apartment next to ours and introduced herself slowly, her Italian lilting and patient. She told us there was a gelateria around the corner we had to try and pointed us in the right direction. Sophie grinned, clutching the warm bread as we said goodnight to her. The next morning was orientation at the art school. The students gathered in a bright classroom with tall ceilings and big windows that looked out over a courtyard. Sophie was seated next to a girl from Canada, who had the same sketchbook brand she used. They started comparing drawings, and by the time the instructor, Marco, came in, the two were laughing like they'd known each other for weeks. That afternoon, we wandered through the streets until Sophie spotted the gelateria our neighbor had mentioned. She walked right up to the counter and ordered in Italian without hesitation. 2 scoops of pistachio for herself and a cappuccino for me. The man behind the counter beamed at her, and I could see the pride in her eyes as she handed over the coins. The program officially started with a visit to the Uffizi Gallery. Marco led the group through the echoing halls, pointing out works by famous artists and telling the stories behind them. When they reached Botticelli's Primavera, Sophie stopped dead in her tracks. She sat on a bench, sketchbook in hand, and began tracing the curve of a figure's arm, the folds of a dress, the cluster of flowers at the bottom. She stayed there for hours, barely moving except to switch pencils. The crowd around the painting grew thick, voices bouncing off the marble walls. Sophie's shoulders tensed, and she paused her sketching. I moved closer, quietly pointing out a less crowded corner where she could still see the piece. She nodded and settled back into her work, until Marco announced it was time to move on. That night, we started what would become our little tradition: balcony dinners. We bought bread, cheese, and fruit from the market and ate while watching the piazza below. Sophie told me about what she learned that day, her words spilling out as quickly as she could think of them. A few evenings later, we walked to the square just before sunset. A violinist was playing near the fountain, his case open for coins. Sophie stood off to the side, sketching his profile as he played. When he noticed her, he smiled, finished the song, and pulled a red rose from behind his music stand, handing it to her with a bow. Over the weekend, we wandered into an art market that had taken over a few side streets. Tables were piled high with handmade goods, paintings, jewelry, leather bags. At one stall, Sophie ran her fingers over a stack of leather-bound sketchbooks. I bought her one with a deep brown cover and creamy pages, the kind that would hold watercolor without bleeding through. The time difference caught up with us a few nights in, and Sophie couldn't sleep. We decided to walk along the Arno River, the water dark and still under the streetlights. Couples strolled hand in hand, and the city seemed quieter, softer than during the day. Sophie stopped to draw the reflection of a bridge in the water before we turned back. Midweek, she sat at the kitchen table writing her first postcard. She addressed it to her late father's parents, telling them about the gallery, the gelato, and the neighbor with the bread. She drew a little sketch of the piazza in the corner before sealing it. We dropped it into a bright red mailbox on the way to class. By the end of that first week, Sophie stood on the balcony one evening, looking out over the piazza with her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She turned to me with a small smile and said she felt like she belonged here. And in that moment, it seemed like she did. A few days into our second week in Florence, the apartment phone rang. I wasn't expecting a call, so I answered cautiously. My mother's voice came through, telling me Ryan was upset because Sophie had missed his son's birthday party. She said it like we'd somehow forgotten about it. I reminded her the trip had been planned and booked nearly a year in advance. She went quiet, then said she'd pass the message along. Sophie had been in the next room, sketching by the window, and overheard enough to know what the call was about. She came into the kitchen holding her pencil and asked if she'd made anyone mad by coming here. I told her she hadn't, and she went back to her drawing without saying anything else. At class the next morning, Marco stopped by Sophie's easel as she worked on a street scene in pastels. He studied it for a moment, then called the other students over to look. He pointed out the way she'd layered the colors to make the light look real, and Sophie stood there with her cheeks pink from the attention. Not everyone reacted the same way. Later that day, while they were setting up for the next session, I heard two students whispering. They were saying she must be rich if she could travel all the way from America for a summer art program. Sophie didn't respond. She kept sorting her pencils, then went to work like she hadn't heard them. That afternoon, we stopped by the post office to check for mail. There was a letter from my late husband's sister. She'd sent a photo of her garden in bloom, and a note telling Sophie to capture the world you see. Sophie read it twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the back pocket of her sketchbook. When we got back to the apartment that evening, I opened my email to find a message from Ryan's wife. She wrote that the money I'd spent on this trip could have been used for Ryan's boys, sports equipment, school trips, and other things they really need. I read it once, then deleted it without replying. The next morning, I shifted my focus back to the reason we were here. Sophie had asked to sketch the Ponte Vecchio, so we headed out early before the bridge filled with tourists. She sat up near the middle, resting her sketchbook on the stone ledge. People slowed down as they passed, watching her work. A couple took photos, and one man dropped a coin on her page before hurrying away. Later in the week, Marco introduced the group to watercolor techniques. Sophie had never tried it before, but she quickly took to the way the paint spread across the paper. She painted a row of flower pots on a balcony, the colors bleeding together in a way that made the whole scene look alive. One afternoon, we ducked into a small stationery shop to buy more paper. The shopkeeper noticed Sophie's sketchbook peeking out of her bag and asked to see it. She hesitated, then handed it over. He flipped through slowly, nodding. When he gave it back, he handed her a bundle of postcards with Florence landmarks on them and told her they were for her to send to friends. The days were long, and Sophie wanted to do everything. Eventually, it caught up with her. One evening, she came to dinner looking pale and tired. I felt her forehead and knew she had a mild fever. We stayed in the apartment for the next 2 days, keeping the windows open for the breeze. She napped, read, and watched the piazza from the balcony. When she started feeling better, we visited a ceramics workshop. The owner showed her how to paint on a white plate using glazes. Sophie chose to paint the Florence skyline at sunset, layering soft oranges and deep purples for the sky. She worked in silence, only stopping to switch brushes. After that, the calls and emails from home stopped entirely. No birthday reminders, no comments about the trip, nothing. It was as if the rest of the family had decided to wait until we came back to say whatever they had to say. With the outside noise gone, the days settled into a rhythm, classes in the morning, exploring in the afternoons, balcony dinners at night. Sophie carried herself differently now, speaking up more in class, taking her time when strangers stopped to look at her work. By the end of that week, it was clear she was growing into herself here. And standing there in the piazza one evening, watching her sketch the fountain while the light turned golden, I knew we were exactly where we needed to be. Midway through our third week, Marco approached us after class and said he had something special planned. That evening, he led Sophie and me down a narrow street lined with old wooden doors, stopping at one that opened into a warm, brightly lit studio. The air smelled faintly of paint and melted wax. Inside, local artists were gathered for a private event, their work displayed along the walls. In one corner, a man was shaping molten glass into a delicate vase. The glowing orange orb spun slowly on the end of a rod as he worked, and Sophie stood a few feet away, sketching each movement. She captured the way the glass stretched and curved under the man's breath, the shimmer as it cooled into shape. The Canadian girl from Sophie's class was there too, and the two of them found a quiet table to compare their drawings. Before we left, they exchanged small sketches as keepsakes, a pencil drawing of a street scene from Sophie, and a watercolor of a flower market from her friend. Over the next few days, I started noticing how different Sophie's interactions had become. At cafes, she ordered for both of us in Italian without hesitation. She struck up conversations with other students while waiting in line, asking about their work, and showing hers in return. One afternoon, we stopped at a flea market set up in a shaded square. Stalls were piled high with old books, hand-painted ceramics, and art supplies. Sophie found a set of watercolor paints in a tin, the kind that had clearly been used and loved. She asked the vendor how much, then bargained confidently in Italian until the price dropped. She handed over the euros with a smile, cradling the tin like a treasure. Back at the studio, she began working on her first full landscape painting, a rolling Tuscan field under a wide blue sky. She worked on it for hours, over several days, adding small details each time. When it was done, Marco announced it would be included in the final student showcase at the end of the program. During one of the afternoon breaks, another parent from the program approached me. She said she'd been watching Sophie's work evolve and that it was clear she had a real gift. She told me it was good to see a parent supporting their child's passion so fully. On our last weekend in Florence, Sophie and I climbed a hill overlooking the city just before sunset. The terracotta rooftops glowed under the fading light, and the Duomo's dome stood out against the sky. We sat on a bench, watching the colors change. Sophie turned to me and said this meant more than anything they could buy. I didn't need to ask who she meant. The next day, I got a message from my cousin back home. In passing, she mentioned that Ryan's boys had just gotten a new gaming setup from my parents. I didn't bring it up to Sophie. Instead, we decided to spend the day exploring side streets we hadn't walked yet, finding tiny shops and hidden courtyards filled with flowers. That evening, we took a pasta making class at a small family-owned restaurant. Sophie rolled out sheets of dough, cut them into neat ribbons, and dusted them with flour. The chef teased her about being a natural, and she grinned, holding up a handful of perfect tagliatelle. Later that night, after we'd eaten our pasta and returned to the apartment, Sophie went out to the balcony with her sketchbook. The piazza was quiet, except for the murmur of voices from the cafe below. She sketched by moonlight, the outlines of the buildings sharp against the dark sky. It was clear she was coming home different from the girl who had boarded the plane with me. She moved with more certainty, spoke with more confidence, and seemed ready for whatever was next. Watching her work that night, I knew this trip had been the start of something much bigger for her, and it was only the beginning. On our last day in Florence, the art school hosted its final student showcase. The studio had been transformed into a gallery, the walls lined with canvases, sketches, and watercolors from the past month. Sophie's Tuscan landscape hung near the center, framed simply but lit in a way that made the colors glow. Visitors paused in front of it, leaning in to study the brushwork. A couple of people asked her questions about her technique, and she answered them easily, gesturing to different parts of the painting. She stood there in her linen dress and sandals, explaining her choices like she'd been doing it for years, nothing like the quiet girl who had stepped off the plane weeks ago. When the event began winding down, Marco came over carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was an old paintbrush, the wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. He told Sophie it had been his for decades, and now it was for her next stage. She ran her fingers over the bristles, holding it carefully as if it were made of glass. Before we left the studio, Sophie made her way around the room, exchanging artwork and contact details with her classmates. The Canadian girl gave her a watercolor of the Arno River at dusk, and Sophie gave her a pencil sketch of the Ponte Vecchio. They promised to keep in touch, and the goodbyes stretched out until we had to leave for the airport. The flight home was long and quiet. Sophie fell asleep not long after takeoff, her sketchbook open on her lap, a pencil still resting in her hand. I pulled a blanket over her and watched the clouds pass below us until the cabin lights dimmed. When we landed, my parents were waiting at the arrivals area. They greeted us politely, their faces unreadable. My mother said she hoped the trip went well, then moved on to talking about traffic on the way to the airport. Ryan was there too, leaning on the railing. Before I could even get my bearings, he started telling a detailed story about his son's latest soccer tournament and how one of them had scored the winning goal. I listened without responding, just steering Sophie toward the luggage carousel. Outside, while we were waiting for the car, Sophie pulled a small package from her carry-on. It was the ceramic plate she had painted of the Florence skyline. She handed it to her grandparents. My mother took it, said it was nice, and set it in the back seat without another word. Back home, Sophie unpacked her suitcase, pulling out her sketchbooks, paints, and brushes. She cleared a corner of the living room and set up a folding table, arranging everything just so. She called it her studio and hung one of her smaller watercolors above it. A few days later, our neighbor stopped by. She had seen Sophie's sketches when she visited and asked if Sophie could draw her garden. She offered to pay for it, but Sophie just smiled and said she'd think about it. The next afternoon, she was out there with her sketchbook, sitting under the shade of the maple tree, capturing every detail. Word must have traveled quickly because within a few weeks, 2 other neighbors had asked if she could do portraits of their pets. She agreed to one and scheduled the other for later, her new paintbrush from Marco resting in a jar next to her. Even some of the family began to notice. At a weekend barbecue, one of my cousins saw the framed landscape from Florence hanging in our hallway and commented on how good it was. She seemed surprised when Sophie mentioned she'd done it herself. Others nodded and murmured about her real talent like it was something they were just realizing now. In the evenings after dinner, Sophie often worked at her table while I read on the couch. Sometimes she'd pause, tilt her head at whatever she was working on, then go back to painting. One night she set her brush down and told me she was glad we went on the trip. She said the boys could keep getting more things from the grandparents. It didn't matter. She already had something better. Looking at her then, I knew she was right. What she'd brought home wasn't just a stack of drawings or a head full of memories. She'd come back with a sense of independence, the ability to speak for herself, and the confidence to share her work with the world. That wasn't something anyone could buy for her or take away. And as I watched her lean back over her sketchbook, humming softly while the brush moved across the paper, I knew this was only the start.